Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us. We hope it's going to be a fascinating conversation around the transformation of learning institutions. My name is Gaell Manguy, and I'll briefly introduce myself and invite this remarkable group of panelists to participate in the conversation. So I'm the Director of Internal Relations at CRI, the Center for Interdisciplinary Research, where I have the pleasure to develop the Learning Planet initiative. The Learning Planet is a network that is joining the upper ground and the underground. We call that the middle ground, and that is the institutions like UNESCO that are very important for the education policy. We are connecting that level of institution with the level of the practitioners and the innovators that are implementing new programs on the ground, so that we can connect those two. And the Learning Planet has been in particularly launching a festival in last January, where we had more than 500 speakers across the globe discussing various issues of the transformation of the education system. And one of the key components is the fact that we need to move towards collective problem solving. And this session is in a way a follow-up of that particular aspect, where we would like to deepen the conversation around especially the hurdles and the gaps that remains in our understanding of how we can scale a collective problem-solving approach. And to discuss that, during this session, I feel really privileged to have such a good panel of specialists of the questions. So we will hear from Valerie Hannon first, who is the co-founder of GELP, the Global Education Leaders Program. Then we will hear from Irina, who is the co-lead of Learning Societies program at the Jacobs Foundation. Then we hear from Elena Proden, who works at UNITAR, and she's a senior specialist of SDGs and strategic implementation of the 2030 agenda. Then we will hear from Andreas Schleicher, who is the Director for Education and Skills at OECD and is leading PISA and is thinking about how to transform PISA, and we hear about that. And we'll finish by Francois Taddei, who is the chairman of the board of CRI and founder of Learning Planet. So without further ado, Valerie, please, it's a pleasure to hear from you.
Thank you, Gaell. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be a part of this panel. I'm looking forward so much to hearing the discussion. Falls to me to kick off the discussion. So let me set out perhaps a few parameters in so doing. Gaell, you introduced the theme and the topic around the issue of collective problem solving. But I think all of us on this panel, and perhaps those participating, are interested in broader objectives than just collective problem solving. That is one piece in a repertoire, an armory of techniques and approaches that I think we all want to adopt in order to broaden the outcomes of our education systems. And it's that fundamental objective, that transformative objective, that I think we need to keep in view. In the OECD's Education 2030 project, the ultimate outcome is described as being the future we want. In my last book, I described it as thriving, not just human thriving or human flourishing, but thriving at least 4 levels, thriving at the planetary, the global level, thriving at the societal or community level, thriving in terms of our interpersonal relationships between each other, but also thriving as an individual in terms of one's self-esteem, sense of identity, sense of personal purpose, and mental health and calm. And it seems to me that finding a way in which these interrelated objectives can be realized through learning is the task of our generation, in fact. And they're all deeply interrelated. Unless we manage to thrive as a planet, we're toast. We have no future. Unless we manage to get better, thriving, healthier societies, which are more equitable, which are more democratic, and so on. I'm sure I don't need to fill that out. So if that's true, collective problem solving is a hugely important dimension of it. It's not the only one. There are others, I think, other techniques, other approaches that we need to feed into this whole attempt to create a wider repertoire of outcomes for learners. OECD has described those in enabling young people to adopt competencies, knowledge, skills, values, and aptitudes that will bring us towards those 4 levels of thriving. Now, the question really for this panel is, what's the problem? Why aren't we getting traction with this? Why isn't it self-evidently the case that this is really the direction in which we want all to be moving? And my own theory of change, if you like, or the conclusions I've come to in trying to understand why over a kind of lifetime of trying to work in this direction, we've had so little traction and so much resistance from systems, is that it is profoundly misaligned with the dominant narrative about education, a narrative which is so taken for granted, so commonsensical, so tacit, that it's hardly even debated. And that is fundamentally an economistic narrative. And I think we will struggle to get the traction we want unless we are completely clear that we have to present a very different kind of narrative about what education and learning is for, before we can get to the point where these kinds of approaches are adopted and adapted broadly, not just by activist practitioners, but by systems as well. So what's the existing narrative? Well, the existing narrative is, as I've said, economistic. Countries, nations, jurisdictions fund education because it makes them more prosperous, usually defined, by the way, as GDP. And individuals profit because through going through education, they will get more credentials and they will get better jobs and therefore better lives. These are utterly narrow definitions of what success is. And I think we have to raise the debate really about what a thriving life really is going to be like in the latter part of this century, where so many of the issues are really not even addressed by those kind of outcomes, but rather what we need to have is education systems which are really focused on enabling individuals and societies and the planet herself to thrive. And this is a very, very different approach. Now, to really conduct that narrative, we have to have different kinds of conversations, use a different kind of discourse, use a different kind of vocabulary in our communities, at the school gate, teacher to parent, principal of school, university leads. All of these people, I think, need to look at the question, what is education for? And start to conduct a different kind of debate around it. If we get a different kind of narrative, I think then we will start to make progress and say, right, in that case, we do need to look at really significant issues like, how do we create collaborative ecosystems where providers of education are not confined into silos, institutional silos, but work really collaboratively to provide terrific new pathways for learners? How do we enable young people to find these new competencies which have been set out by so many really interesting education providers now, and go way beyond the low-level competencies of literacy and numeracy, but the easy to learn, easy to test, and increasingly overtaken by information technology and digital technology. So my starting point for the panel, I guess, is our objectives are actually out of alignment with the major predominant public discourse about education. And unless we get into that discourse about relating education to the serious future that we want, we will be trapped in the old paradigm, which will not allow us to make the kind of progress that I think we need. So that's my kickoff to get us moving.
Well, thanks very much for that. This is very inspiring. I feel like we are back to the festival again and we want to learn to take care of oneself, others, and the planet, even though you didn't say it like this. Irina, as you are working at the Jacob Foundation, maybe you want to give us your perspective on what is for you the biggest hurdles and problems for changing the paradigm.
Thank you so much. And what a great kickoff, Valerie. Thank you for that. I think it really, triggers that idea of, why is education in many ways still the same as it has been 50 and 100 years ago, whereas other systems in communication, transport have changed so fundamentally. And I think that the good news is that what we've been seeing, I think, from a foundation perspective, is that there's a growing awareness of more and more actors of what it is needed and required in terms of mindset shifts and behavior change and value change to really scale, I would say, innovation and knowledge within the education system. I think this being said, what we have identified, I think more from a general systems change perspective in education to be some of the key challenges is, I think, firstly, that knowledge and evidence on what works and what we want to be focusing on is either not relevant, not available, or not understood by key decision makers and change leaders within the education ecosystems. We also see that, as you've mentioned, Valerie, there's the education ecosystem is extremely fragmented and not aligned, basically leading to I would say, ineffective and overlapping allocation of resources and efforts. We also see that the challenge, I would say, that there's a natural tendency of all of us and of organizations to really favor and be excited about innovation and not looking at the nitty-gritty details of scaling an idea and a proven concept within a system. And then lastly, I think there's the lack of understanding of the other parties within the system, understanding their constraints, interests, motivations. And this ultimately, very crucially, leads to a lack of trust within the system that is impeding, I think, some of these collective problem-solving approaches. And this also, in the end, leads to a lot of small-scale projects, insufficient funding, and I would say also not enough patience that is required to effectively bring something to scale and change the system more sustainably. I think scaling and change practitioners around the globe show that, it generally takes 15 years from an idea to scale on a national level, and that out of 20 proven models, one actually makes it. So that just shows the fragmentation, I think, within a system, and is really impeding, I think, a lot of the change we are really seeking to get to. So it requires more than a proven approach, this kind of sustainable systems change. And it requires also looking at all of the underlying systems and processes within an education system. So including shift of values, mindsets, behaviors, and relationship between the actors, from the policymakers to the practitioners, to the families, parents, and children. So of course, I think this idea and shift is easier said than done. And I think we as a foundation have had our own share of mistakes and continue to make them over the last couple of years. And so, even historically, we have ourselves been contributing to these challenges in funding many small-scale projects with limited timeframes, looking at, I would say, measurable outcomes. And so it's really been only over the last, I would say, five years that we really realized that if we want to achieve our goal of that sustainable systemic change to enable all children to have the learning opportunities they deserve and to thrive, as you mentioned, Valerie, together within their societies, we really need to take that different approach. And so what we mean by taking a learning ecosystem approach is that we have a diverse and trustful community within each education ecosystem, from policymakers to businesses to academia, that really have a shared purpose, a common understanding, and work together and continuously learn and evolve together through time. And as a foundation, I believe we have a very unique role to actually support that community building and community weaving approach within the education ecosystem, as we are in a, I think, better position to fund and support fundamental knowledge generation. We can take risks that other players cannot take. And ultimately, we can broker relationship and support trust building because we are an unvested partner and player within the ecosystem. And this, however, nevertheless, also on our side requires somewhat of an additional mindset shift. And we always like to see ourselves, although I think we continue on that journey, to be a low ego organization. What does that mean? We need to let go of our brand. We need to let go of some of our own ideas. We need to let go of control that we usually like to have, and really allow us to focus on that collective problem-solving approach, community weaving approach that we see is so crucial in this common endeavor. And really also experiment in how we can foster innovative partnerships and find that, I would say, sweet spot that allows to find that common purpose between different organizations. And, you know, just and I'll end with this, I think a specific example we have been working on in one of our countries in Côte d'Ivoire, where we have really actually spent 5 years and a lot of patience since 2015 to just build the relationships with the different actors in the system, including the private sector, the cocoa chocolate industry, including the government, including academia, to understand the individual motivations, their interests, the power dynamics, the politics, and really try and structure a common, I would say, understanding and objective around improving quality education within that ecosystem. And we're still only at the start of it, just, you know, showing how, I would say, in the end, a lot of patience and understanding is required in this field. So with that, thank you. And I'd love to hand over back to you, Gaell, or directly to Elena, as you prefer.
Well, thanks very much, Irina. This is really heartwarming to hear, especially, I mean, I pick that you also share the vision that we should go beyond silos, egos, and logos. And we need to really work on an ecosystemic way, and that's absolutely what we are also working on. Elena, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Gaell. So I think it's also builds up very nicely that I have the opportunity to speak after Irina, because I hope I will be able, and I will talk about the initiative, I will be able to demonstrate that we can sort of go down this pathway when we can overcome institutional silos and work together to address the needs of different professional communities. Us as UNITAR, basically, we've accumulated, for example, a lot of experience in strengthening competencies and capacities of civil servants working directly with the governments, but also with the national public administration schools. But we've been also developing more and more of learning services for different target audiences, including private sector, a lot of youth. Now, among the beneficiaries of our courses, there are a lot of young people. But what we realized a couple of years ago, together with UN System Staff College, that indeed there are so many offerings out there on the SDGs, but it's very difficult to find them. We continue delivering them on our own platforms, like FAO, for example, on Food and Agriculture Organization on their own platform, World Trade Organization on their, etc. And sometimes we don't necessarily realize when, sometimes perhaps there is an overlap. And in other cases, it's just our learners don't know how to find these things. And so we came up with a very simple initiative first, that was the creation of a gateway that provided basically access, a smart way to search and find courses on micro-learnings on various SDGs. We have 59 partners, including a lot of UN agencies, but not only. We also have a lot of universities, some private sector organizations. Basically, last year we marked, I think, by the end of the year, 60,000 users on the platform. But at the same time, we felt that it's not enough, that there are learners who really want to have a much smarter learning service. And we came up with this idea, why don't we provide them a self-assessment service to help them assess their knowledge and competencies relevant for the SDGs, and then formulate their learning pathways based on that. We thought of using UNESCO SDG competency framework. So we are collaborating on this work now closely with UNESCO, to basically develop the assessments and map the learning products, but also develop some learning products together that would support the development of these competencies. And basically what is quite interesting that they define these 8 cross-cutting competencies that cover systems thinking, anticipatory competence, normative competence, strategic, collaboration, critical thinking, self-awareness, and also integrated problem solving. And of course, a lot of them are relevant also for the topic we are discussing today. And they also defined 3 types of objectives for each of the 17 specialized competencies, looking at the cognitive level, socio-emotional level, what the learner should be able to do also at the behavioral level. So there are 3 levels also for the specialized goals. And basically we are developing now the assessments that would enable participants to basically self-assess themselves. They would see something like that, like a score. And then also we are now reviewing all the learnings that we have with the partners to be able to actually map and recommend the learning based on the competency requirements of a person. And in addition to that, another layer that we've added is related to the professional ambition of a person. So we've defined several mental models through a qualitative approach where we try to identify who are our main learners coming to the platform. And that we've seen that some of them would be, for example, more of a policymaker, others a business person, data person, maybe simply citizen. A lot of people associated themselves with community builders or communicators. So we provided this additional layer, and we are building up this system to help learners basically in a smart way to self-assess themselves against their current level of competencies, cognitive, socio-emotional, behavioral, but also against what they actually want to achieve and in a way they want and can contribute to the SDGs, and then guide them through the learning pathways. And I will stop here on my small pitch. Thank you, Gaell.
Thank you very much, Elena. It's quite fascinating to see that on your platform you have people coming from all kinds of different backgrounds, and especially seniors, above 50 and so on. So it shows that people really want to engage and try to see how they can help tackle the SDGs. Andreas, can you have the floor now to present PISA and its transformation?
Yeah, thanks so much, first of all, for putting this point of a collaborative culture on the agenda. I really believe this is the crux in education. You know, we spend so much time to push ideas into education systems, sometimes good ideas, sometimes not so good ideas. We spend so little time to find the good ideas in the classroom, to scale them, to spread them, to share them. And, you know, you ask yourself, you know, why this is the case. I think it starts with one of the big drawbacks in education is that we don't even have a common language, a shared narrative. You know, you just heard a framework, you know, from UNICEF about competencies. And I can tell you there are, you know, endless numbers of frameworks, of narratives. Everybody has their own kind of idea of what competency and what lists of skills and knowledge and values and attitudes really matter. I think that's one of the struggles that we have in education. I think it's also true for educators in the classroom. You know, there are so many different pedagogical ideas, so little research and evidence of, you know, we build our work on experience rather than on knowledge and education. And that is so different, you know, when you look into the field of science, where you can put scientists from any place in the world together in a room and they will come up with solutions because they have a common language to collaborate. This is starting point. Second part is, you know, we have a very atomistic culture in education. And where does this come from? Most of the information flows in education are vertical. They are not horizontal. If you're a teacher, you are busy teaching your students. You don't have that much time to connect with the next teacher. If you're a school leader, you have actually no natural space to work with other school leaders. Now, those education systems that are very good at this have created those spaces. Now, if you're a school principal in Finland, you know, you will spend 2/3 of your time running your school, but you will spend 1/3 of your time working in the ministry or in the school administration where you actually frame your own problems with other principals. But you have to create those spaces deliberately. They don't come natural. vertical information flows, very little horizontal information flows. Same is true for accountability. You know, we test students, we test teachers, the information goes upwards into the bureaucracy. We have very little in terms of a professional culture of accountability. You know, if you are a medical doctor, you behave ethically, you're responsible because you feel responsible to your colleagues, to your patients, not to the Ministry of Health. So again, you know, it's a vertical accountability culture, it's not a lateral accountability culture. And it all starts in the classroom. You know, we obviously, you know, and when you think about education, most of learning is about individual skills. You go to a school to learn something for yourself. And then we test it. And we have done that with our PISA assessments as well. You know, we test, you know, creative thinking, we test, you know, social emotional skills, we test, you know, mathematics, reading, and so on. One of the things that we did, just, you know, out of interest, we tested actually the collaborative problem solving capacities of young people. And what was so interesting for us is that many young people at age 15, you know, didn't know where to start. You know, you put 15-year-olds out into the schoolyard and they do amazing things together. They collaborate, they play, they do amazing things. You put them in the classroom and suddenly they don't know where to start because they've never done this. All of the learning is about consumption. It's not about agency. It's not about, you know, working with others. But we've also found amazing difference in this. I give you two examples. You know, you look to the Chinese and the Japanese. They do extremely well on individual problem solving skills. They're great problem solvers when you give them individual problems. When we tested collaborative problem solving, the Japanese did even better on this, and the Chinese did not very well on this. And so you ask yourself, you know, is this culture? No, actually had a lot to do with the learning environment. You go to a Japanese classroom, everything is about collaboration. You know, there's no hierarchy. Basically, students are there to solve problems together, to share even their mistakes. They kind of, if you go to a Chinese classroom, there's a lot of individual competition. You can see the same thing, you know, in the teaching force. And most of the teachers will be connected with the school leader. They're not connected with each other. If you want to create that fabric, and I think what we have to acknowledge is that as humans, we are not born with that bridging social capital. We are born with bonding social capital. We like our families, we like people who look like us, who walk like us, who think like us. We actually have a hard time to engage with people who are different. That's the kind of bridging social capital that we need to build in education very, very deliberately. It doesn't come natural to people. No. And again, in the last PISA round, we have started to engage with this. We looked at global competency. To what extent can young people see the world through different lenses, perspectives, appreciate different ways of thinking, different ways of walking? And once again, you can find, you know, amazing variation across this. But for me, really, this collaborative culture at the student level, at the level of the education system, the institutional level, even at the international level, I do think if we do not crack that nut, we will not do great things. You know, why did scientists around the world in 10 months be able to develop a vaccine against, you know, one of the most, you know, devastating viruses? Because they have a common language, they have common goals, they basically are able to pool their knowledge, their ideas, and work together. You know, and teachers, you know, you can put 1,000 teachers into a room, and again, you know, they will have a hard time where to start because we don't have that kind of knowledge infrastructure. So again, I think if you want to address this, you've got to work on this.
Wow, thanks very much for that. It's a lot of to chew on. I guess, Francois, the floor is yours, because when it comes to collaborative problem solving and collaborative environment, this is something that you can cover.
Yeah, thanks to all of you, and to pick up on where Andreas left. Indeed, this needs for collaboration, I think is you know, what Andreas was telling us is that we need to collaborate at all scales. You know, between peers in a class, between teachers, between schools, between countries, and you know, so we have to think about this. And indeed, we have some natural abilities for, you know, at best local collaborations, you know, but bridging already two different people is not easy when you meet them face to face. But if they are on the other side of the planet, you know, you're faced with huge difficulties. But today we do have technologies that can make a difference for at least some of those issues. And I think we have to redesign not only the local interactions, but also the fractal dimensions of those interactions. And to some extent, maybe what we need to do is not only to learn, to collaborate more, and indeed, as one of the participants was saying, we have to have more collaborations in classrooms, especially in countries like France, but we have to have new ways. So instead of and to go back to what Valerie was nicely putting at the beginning of the conversation, we have to frame the environment for collaboration. And instead of competing for yesterday's knowledge, we have to collaborate on today's challenge to create the future. Okay, and we can learn to do this at a very local scale. But if we want to collaborate at scale, Andreas was highlighting that science is very good at doing this. How do scientists do it? They do it because they document what they do, they share what they do, they analyze what each other has done, they peer review, and then they build synthesis, and then they share it, and then they can climb the shoulders of giants, and then they can see further. What's nice is that those very methods can be learned very young. And indeed, the youngest order of scientific publication are 8 years old, and you can learn these skills. And we build, a program like the Saventurier in France, for instance, that can do exactly this sort of things. Training the children that are naturally born scientists, as Alison Gopnik has nicely shown in Berkeley, we can train them to have an environment that foster those complex problem solving abilities and this ability to think like little scientists and progressively build more and more skills while doing this. So we can do this at the local scale. We can also have teachers becoming scientists by, defining their challenges, defining their solutions, assessing if what they've tried works, peer reviewing each other's work. And so we can have teachers as researchers program the same way we can have kids as researchers program. And we can do this the same with principals. We can do this the same with, all sorts of stakeholders in the community. And when we do this, we can also progressively build digital infrastructure that help them to share what they do and document their respective projects. And we can today build artificial intelligence that can read all of those projects and can compute proximities between those projects, so that you may be in Japan and discover that the closest project to yours is maybe in China or maybe in Germany or in France, and you could be connected. Of course, there might be linguistic barrier, but even AI is helping to bridge some of those, and more people speaks at least 2 languages, and so they could be connected by linguistic areas as well, and by geographic areas. And in a way, you could say, what is your challenge, and be matched to people that share the same challenge. You could be saying, what is your dream? And you could be like John Lennon. You may be a dreamer, but you're not the only one. And you want to be matched with others that share the same dream and start working on your dream to make it into a project, to make it into a reality. And I think we do have the technological abilities and the ability to build those middle ground that Gaell was alluding to begin with. And those middle grounds are places where, institutions, including ministries that like to have nice lunches, and all sorts of actors to come together, together with the young activists and the innovative teachers and the researchers, so that we have neutral ground where the upper ground institutions and the underground activists come together to work together to solve things. And those middle ground starts to emerge on many different local places, but we can connect them. And SDG 17 is about working together to solve complex issues. But an SDG 4.7, which is education for SDGs, is about learning to solve for SDGs. And we can build partnership to solve and to learn for SDGs. So that's what I think we can progressively build together. And so I'm glad that we have such a rich panel, and I'm back to you, Gaell, and to the community for the questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Francois. I mean, there is so many dimensions to which this conversation could go. So I think maybe best is, since Andreas has only a few minutes left with us, is to see whether there is some questions directly for him, and then we will have more time to go into different directions. So Josephine, do you have specific questions for Andreas?
There is one question around involving multiple educational stakeholders and into how this would work best in terms of collaborative problem solving, but also decision making. And if you have perhaps any examples of where this has worked or could work best.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. In fact, one of the most interesting projects that we have at the OECD, and Valerie mentioned it already, is our Education 2030 initiative. And what makes it so interesting is, and when we think about, what should young people learn, we involve young people, we involve, educators, we involve parents, and some of the best ideas have come from the young people. And again, and I think in schooling, we are very good in keeping, students inside schools, but we are not very good to keep to open schools to the world. I think the more we make education a whole of society project, where actually stakeholders have an active voice, the more we will help make education relevant. And I think also, someone, I don't remember, I think it was Irina, spoke about the importance of trust. Trust is not, a human attribute alone. It's something that is built through sharing knowledge and information and doing things together. If parents, are not very closely involved in what their children do in school, then why should they trust what is happening with them? So I do think this kind of multi-stakeholder environments are very, very important. We have good experience with this in the OECD, and if you look around the world, the education systems that have gone really well through this crisis, through the pandemic, were generally ones that had, very flat, very collegial, very entrepreneurial, very open environments in which stakeholders, from across society had a say and a role and a responsibility.
Gaell, could I ask Andreas a question? A little bit of interaction between the panel, I declare.
Yes, you be my guest.
Andreas, am I right in thinking, and I'm not sure the accuracy of this, but am I right in thinking that the OECD tests or assessments, which I think are brilliant actually, are on global competence and on collaborative problem solving, have not been as enthusiastically taken up by OECD member countries as you would have liked?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely true. I think everybody knows PISA for reading mathematics and science. Very few know the work on social emotional skills. And that's in part by take-up. But, we should not just blame politicians for this. We can see actually the same reaction often in the teaching profession. Teachers say, well, I'm so busy teaching mathematics. Why do you actually now ask me to to look at creative kind of mathematical skills? So there's actually also a reaction in the profession often that this is an additional burden. This is an additional extra. No, that's not our core business. So I think we should look at this holistically. It's not just, governments not, showing an interest. It's also parents. Parents say, well, does my child need this to get to Harvard? I think, again, there comes this attitude, very kind of instrumental view that we have on education. And even though I call those skills actually the hard skills of tomorrow. When people talk about soft skills, I get very upset because I believe, a lot of knowledge that we acquire today is very soft. Tomorrow is going to be out of date. A lot of, when you think about empathy, courage, curiosity, those are the hard skills in the 21st century. But, they are still on the margins. They're not included in our gateways. They're not included in our exams. They're not included in the mindsets of educators. It's much harder to teach, to educate than, to just transmit knowledge. To be a great coach, a great mentor, a great facilitator is a much harder job than just to be an instructor. So I think there are many players, many resistances in education towards that.
Yeah, I thought that was the case, and I'm not just blaming politicians here, but the fact that there is this resistance from multiple sources really just for me demonstrates the grip that the old paradigm or mindset around what education is for has on us. And I just feel so strongly that unless we really get to grips with that and attack it at its root, all these things remain marginal and peripheral. And are kind of not incentivized by, because what teachers are prepared to do, going back to your point, is partly what they're incentivized to do, what they're held accountable for. So that the system is integrated in that sense.
But I think, Francois has given us some interesting answers to this. I do think technology today provides opportunities for teachers to collaborate peer-to-peer. We no longer solely rely on the kind of vertical institutional structures. We actually now have the means to actually directly connect learners, directly connect teachers. And I do think that is the transformation that we could see. And I'm actually quite positive about it, because this is exactly what happened in the COVID pandemic. I was working as a country, India, one of the most sclerotic kind of educational bureaucracies. It's almost impossible to get a curriculum reform into any classroom because you have to go through so many layers of administrations. Suddenly comes the pandemic, and suddenly teachers look directly to those kinds of platforms where they can directly access material, share their own ideas. And suddenly, technology is empowering people to become actors in the system rather than consumers. So I have hope. I think Francois' point about, using the technologies of our times to build the kind of lateral, horizontal kind of information flows, I think is very promising. But, nobody knows.
Before you leave, thanks for this. We are very aligned. And I think, to take Valerie's point, we have to align all the change makers, all those that have interest in seeing the change, okay? And to some extent, the virus is, as you were nicely putting, sort of an ally, an unexpected ally for the transformation that we are talking about. More and more people see that, in order to face such a challenge such as the COVID one, we need to collaborate, we need to change. And then when they learn to collaborate to face that challenge, then they can learn to collaborate to face the climate challenge, and then the AI challenge, and then the robotic challenge, and so on and so forth. But to some extent, maybe we could think of, aligning everyone, including the younger ones. And so, the younger ones are very keen to have all these digital technologies. They are using it already. And so if we were inviting them to define, what is the learning ecosystem that they are dreaming of, and, we could do this with, all the stakeholders, including the countries that we want to play this, but also the NGOs, the foundations, and so on. And we could build an ecosystem where we could help to hear the learner's voice, because their interest is to become problem solvers, because they know that there is huge problems ahead of them.
Very much agree. And I do believe this is the time to make it work. I think for the first time, we actually, in a way, we have the strength of, new technologies, new ways of working, and we have a certain weakness in the old institutional structures coming out of the pandemic. So I do think this is the moment to make this work. And I think, your point about science is so important, and it's not just about science having the means. What we have in science also is an attitude that, if somebody questions me or put my ideas into question, I'm not dead, I'm not, devastated. Actually, I learn through everyday new. I'm willing and I'm open to unlearn and relearn when the world and the context change. And I wish we would have a little bit of more of that in the field of education.
Well, I don't want to cut across the grain of the importance of collaboration and the whole sort of problem-solving focus. Of course, it's immensely important, but I just want to keep in focus the breadth of the learning outcomes that we're all talking about here. And, collaboration is not necessarily the solution to developing a healthy interior life. There are issues about thriving intrapersonally, which in particular, I think, interaction with the arts is incredibly important for. I mean, the writing of poetry, the painting of a picture, the creation of a sculpture, creative expression, so sometimes collaborative, is sometimes really importantly highly individual as well. And so I just don't want to put all our eggs in the basket of saying we solve all our problems through a collaborative approach or a problem-solving approach, because not everything is a problem, in a sense, to be solved. There are challenges and spaces and opportunities. But, if you've got a hammer, sometimes everything you see is a nail. And I just want to keep in focus the breadth of the outcomes and the possibilities that we see for human learning.
Absolutely, very point well taken. I think it's very, very important. And the fact that we need to develop the way people feel is extremely important, and actually start from any collective problem solving approach, because if you don't feel what the problems are, then you are not solving for the right thing, right? So Francois was saying that the youngest kids are scientists are 8 years old. The youngest Nobel Prize is 17 years old. So that's to the point. We need education should be absolutely cross-cutting on this. Maybe on this, touching a little bit on this question, Francois, another Francois is asking, Francois Gray is asking in the chat, to your point, Valerie, there is so little traction, so much resistance. I agree about the economistic narrative, etc. So what do we do about that form of resistance? What do we do about the fact that we are inbuilt, learners are learners, teachers are teachers, and this is the way to go? And we know so many initiatives, but they are not going mainstream. So what are the resistance and what can we do for that?
Yeah, and I think that Irina and Elena have talked about, you know, the multiplicity of initiatives, of possibilities that are growing. And the question is, how do we work outside in? How do they become the norm and the expectation rather than constantly fighting against the system? Well, I've said already, I think we all have a responsibility to start generating a different kind of conversation at many, many, many levels. And there's a fascinating piece of research that's just come out from the Brookings Institute, if you haven't seen it. It's called Know Your Parents. And Brookings have done a huge survey of 25,000 parents across the world, 14 jurisdictions, Africa, India, Australia, Europe, the Americas. And their objective was to get a sense of what parents thought education ought to be about and for, and what teachers thought about that. And they had three big takeaways. And the first takeaway, and by the way, this is just before COVID, and I do agree with Francois that, you know, COVID is an inflection point and may help us a great deal. But this survey shows that parents are up for it. Parents are ready for a new kind of learning, but they don't have the vocabulary necessarily, or the tools to kind of express the kind of new learning that they want, though the COVID experience has taken the lid off. And some parents are absolutely dismayed by the boredom of the kind of tasks that their kids have been given while they're distance learning. And they're asking, seriously? Is this it? We can't do better than this? But anyway, going back to the Brookings survey, what it shows is that parents are up for what we'll call the new learning. More interactive, more relevant, more personalized, more technologically enhanced. So they're up for it. And how do they get that conversation going? And the second thing that the survey showed, second takeaway from Brookings, is that the biggest influence on parents and what they say they want are two. One is their own kids. Are the kids saying they're engaged, excited, interested, or are they saying they're fed up and bored and, you know, so forth? And the second influence is the kids' teachers. So I suppose I'm saying out of this, I have hope too, that we start to generate conversations in classrooms, between parents, between teachers, parents and principals, that start to give them momentum and give some kind of possibility that politicians who are in a kind of an echo chamber with this kind of thing start to understand that we are in a new space now, and they could actually start to adopt this language and talk about policies which support it without fearing that they're going to be completely ridiculed and it's a form of political suicide. And politics do matter. I don't want to blame them for everything. Of course, you're right about that, Francois, but they set the parameters, they set the regulatory systems, the incentivization, the accountability systems. So, you know, teachers must respond to that. So for me, it's starting those conversations premised on completely kind of different expectations. That's the way I think we need to go.
Thanks very much, Valerie. So we have, I got misled. We don't have 7 minutes left. We have 2 or 3 minutes left because we finished at 55. I wanted to give the floor to Irina and Elena, and maybe Francois, if we have time, for the last reflection on what we were discussing, and maybe what you would like to see. If you had a magic wand, what is it that you would like to change in the system to actually scale those things? Irina, maybe if you want to take the floor.
Thank you, Gaell. If I knew what, I would love to give that answer. And thank you so much for these points. I think what I would like to add is, you know, Valerie, you mentioned parents are already shifting their mindset in changes. There are collaborative approaches, but what we feel also the foundation is that there's not yet enough understanding of how systems are actually changed and how values and mindset shifts. So I think beyond, you know, this specific topic of I think collective impact is really understanding how it actually gets implemented and it changes within the system. So I think more also evidence and understanding understanding of these changes would be something we really also want to focus on in the future, and would hope other actors join in.
Oh, very nice. Absolutely. Elena?
Yes, so perhaps maybe just very quickly, while listening to the discussion, I thought that when it comes to collective problem solving, adult learning may offer some lessons that may be useful, in particular for higher education, but maybe also in some cases for school education. I think there are quite a few examples when it comes to, for example, some of the adult learning principles are, of course, that you sort of have to help learner relate to his professional objectives or personal objectives much easier. So it's often more hands-on and contextualized, etc. But it's also related to the fact that we often say that when you work with an adult learner, it's a person who has already knowledge and experience. And quite often for example, the executive education sessions that we run, they are more on an equal ground where there is more voice to the adult learner, and there is more of this participatory approach about which Andreas was speaking. So I think there may be some lessons that could be taken from there. And the other probably just point very quickly, I think also to support what Valerie was saying, that of course collective problem solving is very important, but it's not the only thing, not the only competence that we need to build. Coming from sort of my own angle, when we talk a lot about the SDGs, there are a number of things that have come up that were sort of on the sidelines. We talk now a lot about leaving no one behind, and this normative competence has become extremely important. And also how, like we see, for example, these in the trainings and the competencies of the civil servants, how the mindsets have to change also in the way they do things. So there are quite a few other things that you shouldn't lose sight of that are important. Some of them may have these empathy dimensions, others not, like system thinking is extremely important for the SDGs. In itself, you can have the knowledge and sort of understand how systems work, but then to actually deal with it, you need to have this collaboration. You need to have collective problem solving. So it really sort of comes together as a package. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Francois, do you want to conclude?
Yes, thank you. I think that we covered quite a lot of ground, and there were many questions I tried to answer very quickly in the chat. But I do think that the silos and egos and logos that you were discussing, to summarize some of what was said before, I think are part of the problem. And we have to find open solutions that are giving open access to scientific publications, for instance, open access to technologies. We have to build new common goods, public goods that will be available to all, so that everyone can benefit from it and contribute to it. And that sort of experience can be learned very young. You can learn to improve, children Wikipedia when you're a 6-year-old. Then you can contribute to the older Wikipedia later on, and you can then learn to use open source technologies, even to code while you're very young, and you can build open science tools. You can contribute to citizen science projects. We can build a framework for collaborations at scale. And I think that there is more and more such local initiatives, but we have to gather them and to build that sort of alliance of all those that want to change. And even for this resistance that Francois and Valerie were alluding to, I think that if we align all the interests of those that want to see the change, if there is ever more people that can be heard, and what's true is that at the moment the younger voice are not heard. I think they are the last non-citizens of the planet. For long, no one was citizen, and then men were citizens, but women were not, and then poor were not citizens, and so on. But today, those that are still not citizens are children. So I think we can do what Korczak was dreaming of, and he built what he called the Children's Republic at his own level in a century ago. We could try to build a digital, global Children's Republic where we could at least hear them and co-construct with them a way to not only hear them, but see what part of their dreams are possible, and what can we do to help them go from being dreamers to becoming active contributors to the changes that they want to see. And it can go through arts, to take Valerie's point, or it can go through science, it can go through their emotions, it can go through their reason, it can go through all sorts of things that can be shared and scaled. And they are already eager to use digital technology. The sad thing is that today the social networks, where they're somewhat trapped by all sorts of advertisement and problems of addictions, should be redesigned so that instead of these social networks being designed to make them addicted to their products, we should build digital technology that are empowering them and are turning them into change agents so that they can contribute to build tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. That was a fantastic session. I hope all the participants had the same thrill and joy than I had. Thank you all very much. And to be continued in other settings, for sure.